Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Ethereum, and we're going to perform some post-mortem price analysis following the merge. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Put out a video yesterday talking about the price analysis of Ethereum going into the merge. And while I said from a fundamental perspective on the macro scale, I think the proof of stake model with Ethereum will be a narrative we run with in the next bull market, the short-term considerations of the macro headwinds facing us are likely going to continue to put downward pressure on the price of Ethereum. So I wanted to provide a little bit of analysis now that we've had the merge and we've kind of seen what way the price broke. Now, as you guys know, I still do remain very cautious under these market conditions. We can see that yet again, Ethereum has been rejected by the bear market resistance band. This has happened time and time again this bear market. Sometimes we have gotten above it, but remember, you have to see follow through, otherwise it doesn't really matter. You can have plenty of fake outs, and this actually got up to the 200-day moving average, just above the 20-week SMA. But the 20-week and the 21-week EMAs, the 20-week SMA and the 21-week EMA now ranges from about 1621 to 1808. And you can see quite clearly that Ethereum has had a fairly compelling rejection off of that level, okay? So it was rejected here at around 2K, rejected here at around 1800 or so. To me, this is a fairly clear indication that Ethereum will continue to face downward pressure. One of the things that I think is worth mentioning are that certain indices like the Nasdaq and the S&P 500, they are starting to flirt with the idea of going down and at the very least retesting the prior low and potentially putting in a lower low. Now, the one thing to consider on this is that if Ethereum retests its low, this is really important, and this is why I want to make it clear how more volatile assets like Ethereum can really underperform Bitcoin in a bear market. Imagine the S&P retests its low, and we see that propagated across risk assets. Okay, so if the S&P retests its low, Bitcoin's likely going to retest its own low, and Ethereum would likely do the same. The problem with that is for Ethereum to retest its prior low, it would need to go down 40%. But for Bitcoin to retest its own prior low, it would only need to go down approximately 10%. So this is a big difference. And this is one of the main reasons I think that the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation simply looks like another distribution phase. And we've talked about this extensively on the channel. If you go back to Bitcoin USD in 2021, you'll remember that we had that secondary distribution phase. And it ultimately had sort of like another double top to it, where we had a first move, and then about 20 to 30 days later or so, we had a slightly higher high, and that was it, right? That was the extent of it, and then the bull market for that pair was over for a long time, right? And ever since then, it's just been a downtrend. It's just been a bear market. We've gotten, a lot of people get excited over every rally, but it's just been a bear market ever since, okay? My argument, and we talked about this a lot in the video, is this not just the same type of move, right? You have the Wyckoff distribution phase on the Ether Bitcoin pair back in 2021 and early 2022, and then we had sort of the move down, just like Bitcoin USD did. If you take a move here from this peak down to sort of that bottom, it was about a 37% drop. On Bitcoin USD, when it made that move down, it was actually about a 50% drop or so, but still a fairly similar type of move to the downside, going into a secondary distribution phase with another double top, okay? Same type of move that I think Ethereum Bitcoin is making right now. And I think you have to look at this from an objective point of view. I've struggled a lot to some degree to communicate some of these points as effectively as I want to. But I do think there is a compelling case to be made that this is just a secondary distribution phase. We've talked about this all year, and it was in May, if you remember, that I flipped bearish on the Ether Bitcoin pair. In the short term, it worked out. We've sort of bounced back up, so you could argue that I'm looking at it from a biased perspective, and I will concede that you're probably right. I am looking at it from a biased perspective, but I still can't help but make the comparisons to what we saw with Bitcoin USD, and now it looks like we're seeing the same thing with Ether Bitcoin. And I'm thinking that it's gonna start coming down a lot more than Bitcoin USD will. And if Bitcoin retests its own low at 17.5, you could easily see Ethereum getting closer to its own low at just under $1,000, which would mean the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation would need to drop quite considerably for something like that to happen. Remember, in 2018, once you had this final move where the Ether Bitcoin valuation peaked at 0.085, which is exactly where it just peaked again, it moved down relatively quickly. And by the time the market cycle bottom was in for Bitcoin in December, Ether's Bitcoin valuation hit 0.0249. 0.0249. This move started in May, and it retail puked out the bottom in December. We had a very impulsive move to the upside. The rest of the move to the downside wasn't because Ether USD was going down per se, but it was because Bitcoin USD was going up and Ethereum just wasn't keeping up with it. Okay, but you could have a similar type of thing where Ether Bitcoin goes down and it hits some type of bottom where that could easily be where Ether USD bottoms, but maybe it's not where Ether Bitcoin bottoms as the last market cycle showed us. So these are just something important to consider. Now, listen, I've been talking about the Bitcoin dominance all year and how in order for us to have the appropriate market conditions to make altcoins more attractive from a risk reward standpoint, we would likely need to see the Bitcoin dominance go up substantially. It's not played out yet, but the dominance is slowly moving higher, and there's a lot of comparisons you can make to 2018 yet again. If you look to see where Ethereum's dominance peaked out in sort of that secondary rally in 2018, it made it up to about 20 to 21% dominance, which is more or less where we just made it again after bouncing off of 15 to 16% dominance, which is more or less where it bounced off over here as well. Bitcoin's dominance bottomed here at around 39%, which is the same area it potentially just bottomed again. I'm not saying it has to play out this way, but I think the most likely direction is Ethereum's dominance coming down while Bitcoin's dominance goes up. I know it's not a popular theory. I know a lot of people that used to like my analysis on Ethereum back in 2019, 2020, and 2021 have not enjoyed my switch to being bearish on the Ether Bitcoin valuation. But I have to remind myself that it's more important to try to remain objective rather than to push a narrative I don't believe in. And I don't think that I don't think we're setting up for a sustained Ether Bitcoin bull market. I know there's some people that are hoping it's going to go up to say like 10%, 15%, like 0.1, 0.15. I don't see that playing out under these market conditions. It doesn't mean it can't eventually happen. I want to be clear about that. It doesn't mean that it can't eventually happen. I just don't think it's going to be happening anytime soon. So with that in mind, one of the things that I've thought extensively about, and I'm just trying to be open with my thoughts. I'm not trying to push any specific narrative here, but do we look at this as an oscillator or do we look at it as slowly gaining value on Bitcoin? And honestly, I don't think there's enough data yet to know. Okay? You can pick a side on it, and whoever's right, I think, will somewhat be lucky because there's just not enough data yet to know. You could argue that Ether Bitcoin is just simply putting in higher lows over the macro scale. So therefore, there exists with a certain amount of or a certain probability that the next bottom could simply be a higher low than what we saw before. If that's the case, then you could make the argument that Ethereum's valuation against Bitcoin is slowly trending higher with time, and that maybe it'll just simply take a couple more market cycles for Ethereum to actually flip Bitcoin. This is one argument, okay? I'm not saying this is necessarily the correct argument or that it will play out, but it's one argument. But before we get, just tunnel vision on something like that, we could also argue that this move over here was just Ethereum finding its true market capitalization against Bitcoin. And perhaps at this point, it's just turned into an oscillator where it comes back down. We need to be open-minded to that. And this is something that I'm going to be focusing on a lot as we sort of watch the Ethereum, I mean, what I think is the continuation of the Ether Bitcoin bear market. And where does it actually bottom? If it bottoms at a higher level than it did over here in 2019, you could make the case that it is slowly gaining value against Bitcoin over time. If it comes all the way back down, then I think the argument is just that it's an oscillator against Bitcoin. This is my opinion on the two most likely outcomes from here. But this is something I think people need to consider and start thinking about now. Is it an oscillator against Bitcoin, or does it continue to gain ground against Bitcoin over the macro scale? And it ultimately, I think, is going to come down to whether you think this phase over here is important, or do you just tune that phase out and just look at it over here. Okay? So yesterday, we talked about this. We talked about how this looks like a secondary distribution phase, sort of like a double top, and that ultimately it's likely going to come back down as people start to get skittish as to whether Bitcoin USD is actually bottomed. And that's actually more or less what happened in 2018 is, you know, the longer we stayed at 6K, I think more and more people were starting to get a little skittish as to was 6K actually the bottom. A lot of us were fairly optimistic at the time, but as time drug on and we weren't going anywhere, more and more people started to get worried, and that's where you saw the altcoin market take a huge haircut, right? I mean, a lot of market capitalization was lost in a relatively short period of time, even though Bitcoin just kind of hung out at 6K for 3 months. So if Bitcoin gets somewhat complacent in, like, say, the 16 to 20K range for a few months, I think you're looking at the slow deterioration, or maybe not so slow deterioration, of the altcoin market cap. To be, just to be blunt, I think that's the likely outcome. And we've talked about the idea of the altcoin reckoning the entire year. I hope you guys have been prepared for it. I've said many, many times, right? Cash is king. I'm not offering financial advice, right? I'm just, my own personal opinion is that cash is king. And I've maintained my personal convictions this year are that if I ever decide I want to buy an altcoin, I need to go take a cold shower and reconsider, because just to me, this just simply is a bear market. And I don't want to get sucked into bear market rallies. I've done it before, and it never worked out in 2018. So I will continue to be patient. We'll continue to see how this ultimately plays out. And remember, I mean, a lot of these patterns just play out, are likely just going to keep playing out time and time again. The cycle just repeats itself, where we get to the point where we think that nothing matters except for, this great fundamental thing, and then we just go back to where we were before. I think one of the difficult things is, a lot of times people might assume that just because something happens, just because Ethereum transitioned from proof of work to proof of stake, a lot of people might say, well, does that mean that it needs to outperform Bitcoin now? It's all relative, right? These valuations are very speculative, and it's just a relative number. Ethereum's valuation against Bitcoin going into the merge could have been 0.2, and there still would have been people that were going to be calling for 0.4, right? It could have been at parity with Bitcoin, and people would still call for it to go 2x. So it doesn't really matter what it is. It's just a relative number that's mostly based on pure speculation. Okay, so this is something I have to constantly remind myself. So don't get too attached to the exact number. Just try to recognize that some of these more overarching patterns tend to repeat themselves time and time again. So I still think it makes the most sense to remain very cautious on the Ether USD pair, especially after what looks like a fairly convincing rejection by the bear market resistance band. Not only one, but two rejections from it, right? Two clear rejections from it. I think it makes sense to still be cautious, to assume that we could easily retest these lows down here. And if we take those lows out, you know what waits below us? The fair value logarithmic regression trend line. Okay? That's what waits below if we're unable to hold these lows. And if the S&P and the NASDAQ put in a lower low, there's a good chance Bitcoin will too. And if Bitcoin's putting in a lower low, I'm guessing Ether USD is putting in a lower low as well. And if that's all happening, then Ethereum's Bitcoin valuation is likely going to take a pretty big hit. So these are things I think you need to consider over the next few months. I'm not saying it has to play out this way exactly, but it's certainly something that I've considered, and I'm taking note of, and having my portfolio adjusted accordingly. So I hope you guys enjoyed the content. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up. In 2023, similar to 2019, I'm looking forward to becoming, to returning to my more bullish views on the asset class. But we need to get through this phase first, right? We need to get through the bear market, and then we can focus on the fundamentals that will ultimately drive more utility, a booming ecosystem, not only for Ethereum but for other cryptocurrencies as well. This will ultimately drive another bull market eventually, but we need better macro conditions first. So try and hang in there. We'll get there eventually. And I know this isn't the most pleasant news. These aren't the most pleasant videos, but I hope people can at least understand I'm trying to provide an objective analysis on something that I do think is likely to come down in the next, like, say, 3 to 6 months or so. We'll wrap it up there. Thank you guys for tuning in. Subscribe, give the video a thumbs up. We also do have the Into the Cryptoverse newsletter. You can find a link to that down in the description below. Every month, we'll pick someone at random to get a free subscription for that month to Into the Cryptoverse Premium. So check it out. Link in the description as well. Thank you guys. I'll see you next time. Bye.